Ultimately, when we look at the size of these tax concessions in relation to the total size of Australia's housing market, it really doesn't look like it touches the sides of the housing supply problem that we're looking at. So we're looking at about $7 billion per year in tax concessions if they were rolled back across negative gearing and the capital gains tax, compared to about $11 trillion in value of Australia's housing market. We estimate that rolling those tax concessions back might reduce supply by something like 16,000 homes over 5 years. That's a very small shortfall in the context of a 1.2 million homes target that the government has over 5 years. And we think there's other ways the government could importantly improve supply to hit that target.
Yeah, so the PM, you're saying the PM is as far as you're concerned, is correct in saying it would diminish supply, but only slightly. Okay, well, now let's get on to what the opposition leader said. His answer to this question was that investment in housing would fall away and it would drive up the cost of rent. How do you feel about that as an argument against dumping negative gearing?
Well, certainly, again, any time that you reduce housing supply, there is an impact on rents. But again, our estimates are that any decrease in housing supply and hence any increase in rents, if these tax concessions were wound back, would be very small. So when we've run the numbers, we're looking at maybe a 1% decrease in house prices. As I said, 16,000 homes, maybe fewer over 5 years. And that potentially flows through to $1 per week on the median priced rental in Melbourne or Sydney. So these are really small impacts. And again, it's not really the main game when we're talking about the issues with housing supply in our cities. We're mainly looking at things like the planning system, like the cost of construction, ultimately negative gearing, capital gains tax. They're not the big impact they're not the big thing that's driving the high house prices we're seeing.
Yeah, so if the Prime Minister and the opposition leader were both correct as far as you're concerned in saying what they did, but taking into account that you say it's minimal, the impact, why do you still say that significant reform of negative gearing and capital gains tax is the way that should be at the very heart of reforming what is happening with housing?
Well, I think we importantly need to remember that there are many other investments that we could be making in our housing system. So, for instance, increasing the Housing Australia Future Fund to ensure that the flow of social housing that we're putting online matches our population growth and the social housing stock doesn't continue to decline as a share of our total housing stock. Those investments cost money, and it's pretty clear that when we look at a tax concession like the capital gains tax discount, if we were to halve that value of money would go somewhere better in the budget than going towards the current concessions to investors in all kinds of assets. So really this is a budget problem, and we think that in the broader conversation around tax reform, negative gearing and capital gains tax should be on the table, and we can spend that money better elsewhere.
So to what extent do you think negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions are responsible for the huge prices that people are paying for homes and to rent in Australia?
Well, as I've said, we estimate that the impact of these tax concessions, if we were to roll them back, it would potentially decrease house prices in the order of 1%. That's a pretty small decrease. We've seen very large increases in house prices over a long period of time. And ultimately what's driving those increases is the fact that Australia hasn't built enough homes to meet our growing population. And so removing the barriers to supply, particularly in our inner cities, as I think both major parties have indicated they are looking to do, that's more where we want to see politicians focusing.
And so if it's only going to lead, because I mean that's the big thing for people, is that like these ridiculous prices that are around the country at the moment. But if you're saying that if we got rid of a significant reform of negative gearing capital gains tax concessions, it would only lead to a 1% drop in house prices, what's the point of it?
Well, ultimately, it's a lot of money in the context of the budget. So we're looking at $7 billion in tax concession just for property alone, $11 billion if you include the capital gains tax discount that would go towards other assets that investors sell. That's a lot of money that we think we could be using better elsewhere in the budget, including to pay for important tax reforms that both sides of politics have said are important in the next term of government.
So what about people looking at the housing market now and seeing the prices and thinking that they're never going to be able to afford them, even with what you're suggesting there, redirecting this $7 billion of money to other areas? is it the case, is it the brutal truth that house prices in Australia aren't really going to come back much from where they are?
Well, I think the best way to deal with high house prices is to ensure that we're building enough homes for our population, building enough homes to meet demand. And if we do that over a good period of time, it is going to take, unfortunately, some time, because this has been a crisis that has been brewing for well over 20 years. If we build those homes, that will put downward pressure on house prices, and it will ensure that over time more homes become affordable, and importantly more opportunities become affordable for young people who want to move into suburbs that are closer to where they want to work, who want to be able to buy a home in the suburb that they grew up in. Those opportunities are a really important part of why we need to be thinking about building more homes in our inner cities. It's not just a story about prices.
Yeah, and so even if these reforms were to get through one day, it's still a long, hard slog. And I guess that the brutal reality, the political reality, is the major parties don't want to touch this with a barge pole.
Well, I think, a lot of politicians, I think, are unfortunately feeling pretty dim on the prospects of tax reform in general. And I think that's probably a little pessimistic. What we've seen is that Australians over an extended period of time have said that the plurality of them, or even the majority of them in some surveys, would support reforming negative gearing and capital gains tax. We saw an extended conversation around this from 2016 to 2019. And over that period, it was a policy that became more popular, not less. So I think when politicians clearly explained the need for tax reform, they explained the budget situation, and they explained that these kind of tax concessions are worth a lot of money that could be better spent elsewhere in the budget, I think Australians are willing to hear that argument.